speakers and authors. So we have Jordi Pujol from Fresh Sound Records, Spain. And we have Francesco Martinelli from Siena Jazz Foundation. And I'm also happy to introduce Jeff Levenson from the Jeff Levenson Creative Group that will just interview our hosting host. So thank you very much and welcome.
Can you hear me okay? Everything's cool? I would rather not use a microphone. Okay. So, but I have just changed my mind. I would rather use a microphone. Thank you for this. Okay. So it's an honor to be here. First thing is I have to thank Jazz I Am and the leadership for having me here and talking with these distinguished colleagues. It feels great to be among all you guys. So one of the things I was thinking about is up here we have represented probably, I'm going to guess, 150 years of experience, something like that. I'm not sure that that translates into wisdom, but it is experience. And it seems to me that Francesco and Jordi, and I know myself, we've done a lot of different things within the ecosystem of jazz. I think one of the requirements in order to survive in the industry is to adapt to it, a little bit like Darwin's theories of evolution. You do what you must in order to contribute. So one of the big questions that I've been thinking about my entire career is the fundamental perspective that I've had from the States, the American perspective of what jazz is. This is like a big discussion. What's that? No. No, just my words. Okay. I hope they're enough. Okay. Okay. So the American perspective, which sometimes is very, well, we say myopic. It doesn't really see the entire world. But I wanted to ask my friends here to offer their thoughts a little bit on what do they think about the European perspective versus the American perspective of jazz. What kinds of cultural differences have you experienced in the course of your years? Jordi, I want to start with you because you spent your early, well, I don't know if it was early, but in the early 90s, you were in New York, you hung out, and you were cool enough to document guys named Brad Meldau and Kurt Rosenwinkel and Ambrose and Glasper. What is your perspective about fundamental cultural differences that interested you?
Well, the difference has changed since the 90s today. Today, the jazz musicians, they are more open in the States than they used to be at that time. So that's why you can see many of them playing with European musicians. That's something that before that year was not very usual. So for me, that's what it really changed. And American musicians, they accepted more European musicians and to share projects with them. And they became also more interested than they used to be at that time, you know. Before the 90s, I've been most of the time recording all musicians in the 80s. So in that era, they don't consider European jazz at all. So they just play it between them. I'm talking about people who was part of the generations of big bands, you know, people that play with Stan Kenton, with Bobby Herman, and they were most studio musicians in LA or in New York. So that period, that was the beginning of my experience. After that, when I started to be interested in the young people was, as you say, in the 90s. I started recording here, local musicians, and then in New York, I went to Smalls. That's the place where I started to be interested in this young generation. And at the moment, I brought people to Barcelona that came here and they mixed it. For example, at that time, Chris Chick, Bill McHenry, Chris Higgins, all the, of course, and Winkle, Brad, but Brad was already here. So this created like a group of musicians that were part of, let's say, of my catalog at the beginning, you know. And that's something that I always try to be stronger in my, I mean, to create group of musicians that you can see them over the years changing, but create an interaction between them. You can find people who is a leader, and then you can find the same guy as a sideman. So I think that that's the best way to introduce to the jazz audience the musicians that I like, you know.
Were you hearing music, were you hearing a sound in New York that was different than what you were hearing here?
Well, it was much different before. Now, I think that there are good jazz in France, in Spain, but it's still different. Every country, I think they have their own roots that they use the jazz language to express, but I don't think that what's doing, for example, in England, which is an scene that I am interested in this moment, it's different. It's really much different than America, but still have their own personality. So it's hard to say if one scene in England it's really different than another scene in New York or in LA, because there are so many scenes in every city. Even in this country, which is smaller, we have 3 or 4 scenes at least. So for me, it's very difficult to say what represents every scene, because I am not interested in every scene. It also is impossible to be everywhere, you know. So that's what I say, that I'm focusing more in a group of people that it's moving in the same area, and that's and the music that they do is what I am interested, you know.
Francesco, in relation to what Jordi just said, is it fair to think of every country in Europe as having its own jazz dialect? Is this a convenient way to imagine the evolution of the music?
I think that Jordi was very correct when he said it is very difficult to identify a single character for jazz in each European country. So by that, I mean that you cannot unify really the music on the national basis.
You cannot?
No, I don't think so. You cannot, there are nowadays, and the talk before us just focused on that. Nowadays, especially, we have such a circulation of musicians all across Europe. So aesthetic liaison, aesthetic alliances are going across borders in Europe today much more than in the past. So I wouldn't say that. Maybe you could say that like 50 years ago, when the circulation was much less, where it was much more difficult for musicians from different countries to play together. So we actually had some specific group of musicians who developed a specific identity of their own music in England, in Holland, in Belgium, in Germany, in some areas of France, Italy, Greece. So that was maybe truer back then. But nowadays it's very difficult to unify on a national basis. But if I may go back a little step to your first question, you know, the difference between European and American perspective.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I don't actually buy that concept on the basis that the definition of the American jazz history has been based on the concept that you expressed at first, that myopic idea of American exceptionalism. And that American exceptionalism applied especially to some areas of the music. So at some point, the history of jazz was told in one of the possible ways. And all the areas of jazz that were not easily coherent with that concept were cut off. So for me, I think I start to understand the jazz of the 20s, not 2020s, 1920s. Yes. So I start to understand that jazz was much more a Creole creation from the south of the United States than something that happened especially in the north. And I think that a lot of that has been erased by the historians because they didn't know about it. They had difficulty to accept the contribution from Spanish-speaking cultures, French-speaking culture, Italian-speaking cultures to the beginning of jazz. And the whole, even the idea that when I ask to my students about the origin of African of diasporic people in the continent of America, the jazz lover, the jazz listener in Europe has the concept that African-originated people, in the majority, are in the United States of America. But jazz, for me, is like a little, there is a tree, there is a trunk, and that is African-American music in Cuba and Brazil, and that jazz is a branch of that tree. I see history like that. So for me, the whole European versus American controversy needs to be reframed in a global history of jazz, which was much more global from the beginning that we actually perceive today.
I think that the prevailing view in the States has been that jazz is, of course, an expression emanating from the slave trade, right? Middle 1800s, and that jazz is an outgrowth of the blues, and that this is, you cannot separate this music from the sociology of the growth of America, the economy that was provided by the free labor from Africa, and that this economy then, in a triangle effect, came back to the UK. The issue, though, that is so interesting, which I would love you guys to comment on, did the jazz come to Europe direct from Africa without first appearing in the States? So does Europe and the territories of Europe have their own direct relationship with the black culture from Africans?
No. I think the jazz came to Barcelona from Paris. So
About what year?
1920, 1919.
Okay.
Okay, and it was the first shows of jazz musicians that came to play here. And then all the orchestras in Barcelona, they used it to include the drums. That was the identification of jazz, So jazz, what they call in the band, they don't call the drummer. They call them, who is the jazz? Who is the jazz? That means the guy who plays the drums, And they don't use the drums just like a rhythm instrument. They use the drums just to make effects, They use, I don't know, yesterday when we went to see that group, Jamboree, Sumbra, no? It's the name? Okay, so this drummer used a lot of instruments to create effects. So that's why they use it. They use it guns, they use it all kind of things. In fact, that's more a show than just a drum, because what they call drums was related with modernity, So that's what they try to do. But I don't think that African culture in Spain, at least, have any influence. So, in fact, I think that the most successful blends with jazz became the Afro-Cuban music and the Brazilian music. All the rest are just experiments, for me. Even the flamenco, I don't really feel that it's as strong as it was the Afro-Cuban music or the Brazilian. Because Afro-Cuban music, the musicians, the American musicians, they went to Brazil and they went to Cuba to learn that influence, to absorb that influence that they put in their music. And Dizzy or later, well, I don't want even to mention Stan Getz because maybe he was too commercial. But there are other musicians that they use it, the Brazilian music in a more authentic way, But the influence is evident. What happened after that with all music from Europe, different countries, Turkey, Israel, that seems, for me, that just things that make the global jazz more open to different cultures. But I don't know if it's a real way to grow up the jazz world, you know. So everybody today can do something different if they want. There is a lot of jazz scenes, so that every scene has not his own language, but there is a certain style that identify that particular group of musicians, as I said before.
I'm sorry, but even in this case, I need to reframe in a way the question to give my answer. Please. It all depends on the definition of jazz that you give. If you talk, which is much more precise for me, about diasporic African music, now the influence of diasporic African music in Europe, you can feel that probably from before Roman times. I teach in Siena Jazz, at the University of Siena Jazz. Near Siena, there is a museum in Colle Valdelsa, a museum of Etruscan culture. In the Museum of Etruscan Culture, there is a vase excavated from a tomb. So we're talking about civilizations that were before the foundation of Rome, 5 centuries before Christ. On that vase, there is a pygmy African musician playing his wooden trumpet. So this means that at that time, probably through slavery, pygmy musicians from Central Africa, not even from North Africa, but pygmy musicians from Central Africa were imported in Tuscany's city for the theater, for the show, for the entertainment of that time. So we got that back far in successive waves across the centuries many times, including all the dances of the Renaissance. All the dances of the Renaissance came in Europe through Spain, through the triangulation between Africa, the Spanish possession of South and Central America, and Spain. All the contradanza, the passacaglia, the sarabanda. Sarabanda, even today, is a name, one of the orishas, of the gods of Santeria in Cuba. Sarabanda is an African word that from Africa moved to Cuba through slavery and from Cuba back to Europe through Spain. So diasporic music, diasporic African music influenced and somehow created European music across the century. Of course, I see jazz as the last ring of this chain. So there is a series of influences coming across the century, and the last one was jazz. But even just before jazz, for example, African American entertainers were coming in Europe before the word jazz was used at the end of 19th century in gospel, spiritual choirs, in minstrel show, because we had black minstrels back then. So Debussy wrote this is Gollywood Cakewalk, and which is African influenced, but before jazz. And or just think of the habanera. The basic rhythm of tango was imported in Europe through Spain, through a Basque composer who went to Cuba, listened to the songs there, published the very famous habaneras in Paris, and Bizet heard one, played in a cafe, and took it very nicely and introduced it into Carmen and became Bizet Habanera, but of course it's not by Bizet. It's by Iradier, who was the Basque composer who found it in Cuba. So that was certainly... La Paloma? La Paloma. El Arreglito. La Paloma also, of course, but La Paloma did not become an opera, but El Arreglito became Carmen's Habanera. As a song, everywhere. But El Arreglito is the song that became famous as Bizet, Carmen.
But you say that all companies that came from Cuba, they came to play at the early century in Spain. And many of these Cuban musicians, they remained in Spain, and they introduced the Cuban music here. And they mixed it with the zarzuela and all the typical Spanish operettas at that time.
Absolutely. Even the fact that we don't actually know if the origin of the word and of the dance, tango was used tango andaluzo was used in Spain even before Argentinian tango. And tango is certainly a word of African origins. So these two traditions mixed and combined. So if you look myopically, as you said, if you look myopically at jazz only, you can get confused. But if you look at the whole history of African diasporic music in Europe, you see a much bigger picture. And then jazz fits nicely in its slot and becomes one of the many influences. And at that point, it doesn't strike you as strange or weird that in Europe took roots and became so many different things, because there was a substrate already there for him to grab into.
The thing that interests me about this a great deal is that the standard of pedagogy tells us that jazz is 125 years old, right? It began at the turn of 1900. And what you're describing is the preconditions that enabled the creation of jazz. I'm guessing that very few people have delved into this in the manner that you're describing, Francesco. And I also think it's very common to cannibalize jazz out of the whole sphere of black culture and think of it as its own separate entity, when in fact, it's probably more accurately, as you described, the last remaining ring of a continuum that dates back centuries.
This is my impression, and also jazz has been artificially cut out of all the other African-derived popular music in the United States. So, who I am to say that Nat King Cole or James Brown are not jazz? I wouldn't be the one to describe this music as non-jazz, following a definition which was not, proposed or even approved by the African-American tradition itself.
And the funny thing is, when I entered into this ecosystem as a young journalist, the discussion about what is or is not jazz was a raging discussion, and I don't think this has resolved itself since that time. I'm not sure that it will ever, but still it guides much of the industry and the marketing and the selling of the music. James Brown, is he or isn't he? We might agree that it just doesn't matter. For many people, though, it matters in defense of the jazz identity. And I have a feeling that in America, this is born out of the need to instill respect for Black American culture, where it is still not entirely embraced, and the racial dynamics and politics that exist in America make jazz sometimes a marginal music. And so this is an ongoing discussion that, for me, involves sociology and politics and marketing, and it's almost as if the music itself is the least important variable.
I don't want to take more than my share of time, but there is a book that I recommend everybody here to read. It is entitled Stamped from the Beginning. And Stamped from the Beginning is the history written by an African-American history professor, Ibrahim X. Kendi, about the history of racist culture in the United States. And he's from there. We have, in Europe, we have plenty of our own racist culture. So I'm not saying that it's just there, but this is the subject of the book. And what you say is exactly a point of view which is true, is happening, what you describe. But, the feeling the need for jazz and for African-American culture to be accepted, not on its own term, but on the terms decided by somebody else, by, for example, European-derived Western musicology, which is analyzing jazz in a way which is not true to the jazz principles. So they are cutting out everything which is not, you cannot analyze in those terms. So I think we have to rediscuss, in order to understand your question about European, American, we have to rediscuss and redefine especially on the basis of the effect that the color line had to the writing of jazz history?
Francesco, I was hoping we could answer this question completely today. No? Okay. We'll try it another time. So,
one thing that he said about what people call jazz in America was a specific music, was not anything that was mixed. So and then when in the 30s the swing era started, that's when jazz became so popular in America, no? So bebop changed everything, and many people left the jazz as they understood before, and they were no more interested in jazz. That's when the crisis of jazz. In the 30s, they already, there are articles on Downbeat and many jazz magazines saying jazz is dead as a question. I read that many times. Every 10 years, the same question is appearing. So I think that jazz never will die because it's the source of all the music of today. Everything comes from the improvisation. So that's the music that have that power, you know.
I think the important distinction is to separate the discussion of the music from the mainstream commercialization of the music or the selling of the music or the consumerism attached to the music. It seems very clear to me that the music itself is in a very healthy place. My impression, and please comment on this, is that years ago it took decades, maybe even centuries, for music to evolve, for hybrids of jazz to appear. But all of a sudden, with digital technology, we have available to ourselves this opportunity to marry a jazz concept with a Turkish music concept, with a hip-hop concept, with a Native American Indian concept. This is all a function of the access available to us via digital technology. So it seems to me that the process that took decades or centuries before has now been accelerated. And we are seeing various new jazz forms that are a natural evolution of things, but they are occurring in a much truncated, shorter time frame. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's obvious that that acceleration that you mentioned is evident. Even for me, it goes faster than me. So in other words, I came from analogic era, and now I am overwhelmed. You know, it's difficult for me to accept many things that are changing the music in the way it's happening. People are still asking me, are you selling CDs? I say, yeah, of course. If not, I will be not here. So who buy those CDs? So, well, we have customers all over the world, but not as much as I would like, but many people still buy CDs. When I bought my last car, the guy who told me, I asked him, please, I want a CD player.
Forget about it.
He said, no, we don't have CD player. Well, then I don't buy the car. So then he found me a CD player, and now I have a CD player in my car. Well, in fact, I changed the car because my oldest car has 20 years, and this country, in this city, the council of the city, they don't allow us to drive cars for more than 20 years. So that's why I was obliged to change. My other CD player in my old car was much better than this one. So the thing is that all these improvements in the industry are something that for me I have to accept because there is no way, and also I think that doesn't give us the same freedom as we had before, because we were talking with friends about Spotify. If Spotify stopped tomorrow, where we are going to sell the music, I don't know. So when I started, we had customers in Birmingham, in Paris, in Austria, in Vienna, everywhere. So one guy don't buy records that you can sell to another. Now you need to go on Amazon, Spotify. So you are, somebody here tell you what you should do to sell your records. You are not free anymore, you know. You cannot sell, you don't put the price, they put the price, they pay what they want. You don't know if it's true or not. So that's the way I see this business today. But I am not interested because I am only interested in music. As long as I can keep going, that's my goal. The rest is the way it is, you know. I have to accept it.
What you're addressing is an audience, like how to deliver the music to an audience.
Well, that's the most important thing, to have an audience. How they arrive to the music, everyone arrived the way. Even the musicians. I was talking to Gerald Cleaver, the drummer, 2 months ago here, and he don't buy CDs anymore. So he say, you want to record a CD and you don't buy CDs? So there's something that is not, I cannot understand, you know. But that's, the musicians, they don't buy CDs anymore, most of them. They just, and the young musicians even less, you know. So they, many of them, the young musicians, they want LPs because they grew up with a CD, and to have an LP for them is like an hour, you know. This is a big thing for them, you know. And the CDs, I think that they are interested because some of them they still sell on the concerts, some of them they sell a lot, and some others they sell a few copies. But that's the only way they can sell records today. You know?
So what does this tell us about kind of the audience and how it has changed? Francesco, what you described with the discovery of the vase, well, there had to have been an audience for this at some point for this image of the pygmy African playing the trumpet to be even painted on this thing. So, the delivery system, in one case, streaming or a vase, helped to create an audience. How has this changed over the decades? How has the audience adjusted itself with the evolution of the music? Do you have any observations to share about that?
Well, of course, Jordi is much more expert and he knows much more than I do about this subject. What I think that, though, that there are some kind of permanent mechanism in the creation of a relationship between the listener and the music. And these mechanisms are always there. And this is not in a way changed by the technology. You still need, for a listener to be interested, to react, or even to identify himself or herself in that specific music, to establish this kind of relationship across any different medium. And all the different technology of the medium can help this. For example, I think that the switch, the invention of the transistor radio changed the radio listening. Radio in the 20s and in the 30s was a big application, a big device, and the whole family was sitting in front of the device, and there had to be something for everybody in the family. So there was the comedy, there was the drama, there was the romance, there was the song for the parents, there was the song for the grandparents, there was the song for the kiddies, etc., etc. With the transistor radio, the radios got smaller, and every single member of the family was listening to his own program. So the teenager kid could tune to the black radio station of his town and listen to rhythm and blues or electric blues and discover a music that he could never encounter live in the suburbs of America. So the technology gave access, huge access, and changed the listening habit in the family, and from that generation came a different generation of musicians playing that music.
And if I may, you just triggered a thought that the appearance of the transistor radio comes post-World War II and becomes this favorite device of the baby boomer generation, which needed to separate from the communal experience of listening to a radio station with the family.
Absolutely. So now we have this, elevated to an N, because we have totally private, and there is this disgregation of the audience, of the collective audience in units. So we have to deal with that, but we have to deal with we have to make an effort or to recognize what can, reunite, get these people together and listening to music through these new devices. But again, I think that we are, as you said, things are changing very quickly. And I would not rule out that something that seems to us established forever, like Spotify, will end in 5 years, and in 5 years there will be no Spotify at all. So because this happened before, in front of us. This happened with MySpace. This happened with things that are now in the archaeology of the internet, and they seemed all powerful at the time. At the time, they seemed to be. And the model, the commercial model of Spotify, as the commercial model of Netflix, is not viable in the long term. It's a short-term profit-making scheme, but it's not viable in the long term. So we have to keep our positions, and don't despair, not be overly, don't panic, and don't throw away your vinyl records.
Let me shift ever so gently, because one of the things that I get from your work and even my work is the idea of advocacy. Advocacy, to advocate, to support, to develop. How much of this has entered into your thinking as a professional, that your mission, your job, your work is really designed to propagate the future, is really designed to help this form not just survive, but to thrive? Have you had feelings of this kind in the course of either running a record label or, of course, doing archival documenting work? Are these things that come to you?
Well, I am not only producing new recordings, I do a lot of reissues, so I am really interested in the roots of jazz, and that's why my label is focusing in two different areas. Personally, I enjoy a lot, as you say, to keeping jazz alive. So, si vols posar allò, posa't un moment. Here, there is... On the top, there are all musicians that I recorded in the 80s and 90s. This is only new recordings, but most of my catalog over these almost 40 years, I released at least more than 2,000 or 3,000 reissues. So the way to keep jazz alive is doing both things from my point of view. I'm not concentrated in the new. The new musicians is what give me, let's say, more inspiration today. But I always like to come back to the early jazz. That is where I grew up, you know. So mixing both things is, you say, like a message. You are giving a message to the people that jazz is a very open scope, have different possibilities. And I don't think that just doing jazz from today, you are keeping jazz alive. Many jazz musicians that I know, young people, they don't know who Lester Young was, for example. Okay, and that's very surprising to me, you know, because it's like you are working in an area that you don't know who were the pioneers in that aspect. So for me, I think that it's important to keep the old jazz known to all people, that not just talk about the new artists, that most of them, they do great music, but they not always have a relation with the past. So that's what I think.
Francesco.
Well, I teach history of jazz in the conservatories, and I do master classes in the conservatory mostly. So my mission is something that was said in the talk before. Stimulate, establish curiosity for the different forms that we can call jazz or associated to jazz in the wider possible way. And also to, stimulate curiosities to discourage talking of music in terms of commercial genre, looking beyond the genre borders, within the African-American derived diaspora music, but also beyond the pale of African-derived diaspora music. So stimulating curiosity is stimulating curiosity toward today's musics, of course, toward musics that are outside of the different European traditions, and toward the past. And towards the past, there is a lot of discovery and a lot of great inspiration that can come from musicians from the past. What is important to get, you know, if you take a 20 years old student and you tell him, please go ahead and listen to all the Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings by Louis Armstrong in the 20s. He or she will never do it. And even if or she does, actually, hardly will have the instruments, the tools, the categories, the analytical tools to understand what these recordings represented at that time. So what is our job is to give them the context and to reformulate their listening, reframe their ears around the ears of a listener of 1925 or 1930, and try to understand how daring, how new, how organic, how different, how progressive was the music by Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, Louis Armstrong to start with, and then proceed with the rest of the history. And that's stimulating the curiosity, not an idle curiosity, but actually a way to listen, learning to listen. And, for a musician to play, to produce sound is very important, is basically the main thing. But the second thing is learning to listen what is around you, to listen what the other musicians in the band are playing, to listen what the audience is reacting to your music. So listening is a key part of the creating music process. So for me, the mission is certainly that, not especially to glorify the past, or not for purely historical reasons, but because these musicians, if you listen to them in a correct way, they are inspiration for today's creation, even more because they were doing it in the context in which it was much more difficult than it is for young musicians today. So for me, yes, it's advocacy, and this advocacy for the job that I am doing is stimulating curiosity and reframing the listening in a way that they can actually get deep into the history of the music.
So what I get from this, which I think is so crucial for us, is the notion of context. When you listen to recordings of Louis from that period, it's very useful. I just think it's a rich way of viewing the context within which the music was created. And this is the sociology of the racial issues and the financial issues, the new technology of the time issues. And I feel that we're in the middle of some transitional moment now. I had said to Jordi earlier, this is a little bit of an anecdote, but just hang with me. The Blue Note Jazz Club in New York, full disclosure, I worked there for many, many years, full disclosure. They built their reputation on the backs of artists named Billy Eckstine, Sarah Vaughan, Carmen McRae, Joe Williams, Chick, Stan, name somebody, they did it. Now, however, there's a transitional shift going on, and the programming really emphasizes the artist Robert Glasper and the artists who work closely with Glasper. And the music sounds like a hybrid of jazz and hip hop and R&B and probably other subgenres that I am not familiar with because I'm not as up on this as I need to be. But what is most clear to me is that the music is emerging out of the context of this moment in 2023. Sorry. It seems to me the music is an expression of its times. And a full understanding of this, when you consider the trajectory of jazz, helps you to understand more fully how the music is an expression of people living at a particular moment in their lives. Basically, that's something you would agree with?
Well, you mentioned about Robert Glasper. Robert Glasper is a musician that really jazz musician. When I met him, was a jazz musician, and he moved to that new hip hop and all the evolution of that black music in America. I'm really not too interested in that part of the evolution. So I prefer to keep or remind myself Robert Glasper playing as I like it. That's all.
Okay. And that is, and you won't be buying any of his new Grammy-winning records or anything? Okay.
Well, as you mentioned Louis Armstrong, we all mention Louis Armstrong all the time. Louis reinvented himself after 1929. No, there was the crisis, the Wall Street crash, the market crashed, the record market disappeared, and he reinvented himself in the 30s as a totally new artist, as a band leader, as a singer mostly, and he introduced the standards in its repertoire, while the repertoire of the Hot 5 and Hot 7 was mostly based on blues and ragtimes. So we have plenty of examples to, to analyze and demonstrate what you say. Or even, this is another favorite subject of mine, musicians in the conservatories in jazz school are listening and analyzing Charlie Parker's improvisation on Cherokee, which he called Coco, and he transformed it into a different piece. Now, when he recorded Coco and Cherokee as a soloist in a big band, people around him in the 40s had listened to the original of Cherokee for 10 years, everywhere, because it was a big hit. It was a big hit by Renoble. It was the main song of Charlie Barnett's orchestra, and everybody and his cousin was playing that song. So everybody knew it. So if you listen only to Charlie Parker playing his version of Cherokee, you are missing a crucial part of the story. And you analyze the notes. You can analyze the single notes and the relations of each note to the chord that comes before, that is playing during that note, and that comes for. And this is very useful in a way. But there is another side of the coin. And the other side is to try to listen to the message that Charlie Parker was giving with that solo to people who knew by heart the text he was referring to, which was the original recording of Ray Noble or Charlie Barnett of the same song. So what I try to do with my students is, let's listen to the, 4, 5, 6 version of Cherokee leading up on 7, 8 years and leading up to Charlie Parker's. And when you arrive there, you listen to the record that they already know very well in a totally different way. And you understand much more about the record itself. So context is reinventing your career according to the market changes and social changes. And also context is the sound context, is how these sounds were interconnected with the sound of that era. I remember Jazz Magazine, the French Jazz Magazine, used to do a fantastic series of CDs. And they were not by artist, they were not by song, they were by year. The jazz recording in 36, 37, 38, year by year. And you listen to that, and you get a panorama, a landscape, where you can insert your tree or your mountain that you are looking at. But otherwise, you don't understand the ecological relationship between the specific object and whatever it was around it.
You're making a powerful argument for educators, the educators in this room among us, to reimagine the way the music gets taught. Again, the myopic view that jazz is learning the Mixolydian scale is not the most complete way to approach the subject. So I think it's a very powerful idea that we should have a more holistic or 360 view of the music within its context. I want to ask you one last question, and then we're going to open up, for questions. Now that we have covered a fair bit of history, beginning with the Roman vases, which I love, this was the Spotify of its day, right? Okay. Does any of this stuff, the trajectory that we have discussed, does any of this prepare us for the future? Does any of this give us some clues on the period we are about to enter and what is happening? We've gone from, the vase to Glasper. We've gone through 40 years of documenting traditional artists that I know Jordi wants to support and archiving music. What does this tell us? What can we learn from this that would help us know what's ahead for us?
Well, I think that, honestly, what some jazz musicians are doing today, as I said before, it's not the way I understand the jazz music should evolve, but there are big amount of musicians that they really keep creating some interesting jazz, and I think that this will be forever. I'm surprising every day with different people that send me demonstrations with transfers, and it's exciting to see how many talent is growing every day. And I think that this is much more than when I started. All these young musicians that are coming in every country, that they give us the opportunity to listen different kinds of different styles of jazz, but still jazz. That's what I want to say when I mention other hip-hop or other styles that I am not interested. But if you keep thinking that this idea of jazz have still a lot to say, I think that the musicians that are coming now are much more prepared mentally. Even some of them, they maybe don't have the background, but listening to each other, they have a lot interaction that create a new panorama that, for me, it's exciting. I don't see that jazz is increases, because has always been increases. So you cannot be increases when you are on 0%, 1%. Less than this, there's nothing.
Francesco, you feel equally optimistic?
I think that there will be big changes coming. There are big changes coming under all respects. Business, population, will dramatically change. Economic and industrial weight. So I think there will be a huge amount of change, and I think that musicians who grew up with the idea of jazz, in a general way, are very well equipped to deal with this. And I see them dealing with this in a very efficient way. And jazz, among other things, was also a leading to a generations like me, for example, leading generation of listeners outside of Europe, outside of European music, to listen to different music world. Ornette Coleman, Don Cherry, those generation were also listening and telling us to go beyond our, listening habits. And this brought us in contact with different styles of music from other continents, with Asian music, with Indian music, with African different music, with South American different. So it was very mind-opening. And jazz musicians are prepared to deal with these changes. And I think they should be especially interested in the redistribution of global power. If we keep looking at this axis that we mentioned at the beginning, Europe, Western Europe, because Europe is bigger than that. Western Europe and the United States of America, that axis is going to shrink more and more. But we have, Nigeria will be, in a few years, the fourth most populous state in the world, just after China and India. That will be this biggest of the African countries. So we have to keep an eye open. And if I might say, this is one thing I feel very much. In this European context, I feel we should go looking outside of Europe quite a lot. And I know it is difficult because the political climate, it is what it is. But I think the change will come from outside, and we need to be ready to ride these waves.
I'm so glad that we're basically ending on a positive note, because I think it's indisputable that we're in the middle of a globalization process that is bringing cultures together. I mean, I just think this has been spawned by technology and you know, mostly technology, I guess, but it's almost an inevitable point that there will be growth or evolution. And if I may say, you know, Jordi used the word forever. I do believe that as long as there are people who still live on the planet, this might be a big question, I'm not sure, but as long as we still have people, there will still be a need to express themselves. And that jazz will become part of the dialect of how they deal with emotions. They will express. So I think actually that's a good thing. I'm getting signals that we have to, okay, do we have time to ask some questions of people? We don't have time. Okay.
Just a moment. I want to say something before.
Oh, yeah.
That considering the market of the records today, jazz has been, industry has been living for collectors, record collectors.
Uh-huh.
And I can say that record collectors don't exist anymore.
Okay.
Because they are all from my generation. Most of them are dead. I am the last survivor, maybe. So that's why many people who was buying records before, they keep the industry. You know, people that collected. He said that in that collection of jazz magazine, you can have a big scope of what's happening every year. So if you take Prestige, Riverside, Bruno, you can see every record and you can see the evolution in the label. And that's what was important. People was interested in this. Now all this music is available at the same time. You have the new music, the old music, and that's why people think that LPs are selling a lot. No, LPs, when they came out, the major labels, they make maybe 10,000 copies or 20,000 copies, 15,000. Now they only make 500,000 copies, but for all the catalogs at the same time. So that's why there are so many records available.
All right, Jordi, we were supposed to end this on a positive note. We were supposed to be celebrating.
Well,
but
I'm here to celebrate.
yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
apparently we don't have time for questions. I want to thank you guys. It feels like a great honor to be here with you guys and talking about this stuff. As you may have guessed, this is a subject that is very near and dear to each of our hearts. I don't think you spend your entire life doing something unless you care about it. I think that's how it works. So it feels like an honor to be among you, and I thank you for this. Thank you.
Francesco, muchas gracias. It was great to hear this importance from the African country. I have an artist.